as a founding ideology of the Turkish nation state. And I'll come back to laicity and secularism and to what extent that in fact really was a structural element of the Turkish Republic, or whether it was not probably more much ultimately a discursive construction. So what is interesting in this context is also not what these histories are about, but also what these histories, the conventional histories, are not about. And there you'll find a lot of things, probably more than you'll find in the other category. Kurds, for instance, are not part of this narrative, even though they constitute between 15 to 20% of the society of Turkey. Back then, in the 20s, 30s, it was probably less. They only figured in these accounts as threats to national unity and as backward tribal rebels. In most works, they're in fact not even mentioned by name, so the word Kurds wouldn't kind of come up there. Now, Armenians, Greek Orthodox, and other non-Muslim minorities, you would also not find really in these histories, especially Armenians were of course completely written out. The sudden disappearance of the Armenian community in 1915 from the territory of what would later become the Turkish Republic is mentioned in passing, if at all. The Armenians, let us remember, were of course a very important, very large community which played a key role in the cultural and political life of the Ottoman Empire. You know, today it's impossible to imagine Ottoman culture, architecture and music without the massive contributions of Armenians over the centuries. So, but in the accounts of modern Turkey, the historical accounts of modern Turkey, Armenians appear, if at all, only as vicious revolutionaries who rebelled against the Turks and wanted to destroy the national space of what then became Turkey. What you will also not find about is the Alevis, which also make up 10–15% at least of society, and who hold a religious culture that is significantly different from that of the Sunni Muslim majority of Turkish society. Alevi history has been one of suffering at the hands of a Sunni state, and there is really not much difference between the Ottoman and the Republican group. Now, but even more tellingly, what is also absent is actually the majority of conservative Muslims that were like the backdrop of Turkish society. And even they were written out of this modernizing official history. Many pious Muslims, you know, whether they were religious scholars or members of religious brotherhoods, felt alienated by the radical lifestyle reforms of the Republic, by the abolishment of Ottoman Arabic script and the closure of religious schools. Their voices were not heard in these accounts as they were reduced to obscurantist enemies of enlightenment and progress. Now, much of literature on modern Turkey reflected, especially historiography, reflected and still continues to do so, this Turkish nationalist perspective. And in these, the only actor of history really is the Sunni Hanefi Muslim Turk, so basically the core of society. And these are pitted against the forces of darkness and regression, be they Kurds or Islamists or non-Muslims. I mean, they were basically the kind of non-citizens of that state, of that regime, but also of the historiography on it. Now, for all of you who have been to Turkey, you know that the outwardly symbols of the Kemalist period is still very much there. I mean, you will see the many busts of Atatürk, many of them, albeit, were erected after the military coup in 1980, but they are everywhere. His photos are everywhere. Children in Turkish primary schools still have to recite every morning the oath that ends with the infamous exclamation, "Happy who calls himself a Turk." And this is, of course, also true in the few remaining Greek schools and the Armenian schools of Istanbul and so on, putting people into, well, I mean, tragic-comic situations, basically. But I also know that the whole area of schools and being different in a national context is not completely alien to the Greek case either. But obviously, we're talking about a national project, and national projects have a lot in common. Now, the history in Turkish textbooks is also still very much a history of victorious elites and not so much a history of the people of Turkey. But again, for all of you who know or follow Turkey a bit, this nationalist hegemony is being challenged from a growing number of actors, social, political, and cultural actors, not the least the government, to the point that we can assert that it has lost much of its grip on society. And there are indeed many critical scholars, not so much in history though, but particularly in anthropology, politics, and sociology, who have challenged and refuted the ethnocentric narrative of the Republic. And they have sought to put the record straight, really, to bring back into the narrative real histories, histories which have been basically muffled or silenced under the national Kemalist historiography. And in Angry Nation, I'm basically trying to contribute to this emerging literature by proposing a framework to reread contemporary Turkey, which of course sounds very grand, and maybe it is, and if you read, you'll see whether it works out. But what I propose is a radical critical, or if you wish, a post-Kemalist perspective, and I will explain to you what I mean by that. But I guess the bottom line is that I basically tried to write a book which I didn't have as a student of modern Turkey, and which really it was kind of in my head, and so finally, at least other students might kind of have the chance to start off from there. Now, I believe that there is a need for a critical post-Kemalist perspective that is able to account for a history of the people of Turkey, and not of the Turkish people, which is a major difference. So what would this kind of history be looking like? It will be based on a few substantive suggestions, which I would like to share with you. For instance, such a critical history would read the official historiography, which we know, as a discourse shaped by its time and used as a tool of nation building, regime consolidation, and propagation of a certain national identity of Turkishness. So do not read it as history. We basically have to throw out Lewis and McFly and all these guys, because their works were above all a continuation of this project of writing a new history, which was problematic in many ways. And it hence also assumes that the themes in this historiography are, well, this will sound terribly post-constructivist to you, but I'll explain, so don't be afraid. But I argue that these fields are discursive fields of symbolic domination, that one should not take at face value, but see as a way of trying to achieve power. This is particularly true for the question of Turkish identity, for instance, or for the issues of Kurds as backward tribal people and enemies of progress, for the presence or absence of Armenians as enemies of the Turkish people, the Greeks as invaders, and also the suggestion that the Turkish Republic was established as a secular state. These are all kind of parts of this discourse which was established in the 1920s, 30s, 50s, 60s, and up to the 90s really was completely hegemonic. Now, in this light, the critical history of Turkey is not shaped by the discursive constructions of the Republican elites. It takes into account the perspectives and memories of the subaltern, the disempowered, the marginalized. These are, of course, these terms have lots of theoretical baggage, but we could go on, the ethnically cleansed, those who were written out of the history. In particular, it chooses to conceptualize the state as a behemoth, as a monster, that is above all interested in the perpetuation of its grip on society and its institutional power. But that is also challenged internally and externally, and I'll come to that. Now this monster, this behemoth, is ready to go at great lengths to ward off challenges to its hegemony. Its key strategies are manipulation, conspiracy, the promotion of intergroup violence, and the incitement of large-scale conflict. And I'll give examples of what I mean by that. Such a critical history understands Turkey's recent past as a field of ongoing contestations between two major players, between elected representatives on the one side and what I call non-elected guardians of the Republic. And by guardians of the Republic, I mean the amorphous network of the upper echelons of power, really, which have been able to shape Turkey's core policies ever since the 1920s. And this network consists of the military high command, the high judiciary, and until very recently, even though it's changing now, the high bureaucracy. This network is often referred to as a deep state. I'm sure you'll have heard this a lot, also in the Greek press. And importantly, what I would like to say here just from the outset, this is not a war between the good Democrats and evil conspirators. It's much more messy than that, and often both sides use the same methods of manipulation and look often very much like the same. So, it's all okay. No problem.
Because somewhere between the subaltern and the discourse, if we're gonna, and the noise outside.
It's good to be reminded of the materiality of experience. Not everything is a discourse. So, a critical history of Turkey, as I'm trying to kind of develop it, is hence more concerned really with how state behavior shapes and determines the lives of people. So, to give an example, it is not most conventional accounts, for instance, sought to understand how the homogeneous nation-state of Turkey had to defend itself against an ethno-nationalist movement like the PKK, the Kurdish Labour Party. In distinction to this, a critical approach would be interested in understanding how military strategies impact people's immediate experiences in a Kurdish village. Well, this doesn't mean that I'm not interested at all in what the state thinks, but I'm trying to tell the story basically from the margins, from how people actually experience state action. And instead of using as an analytical lens or main reference elite discourses, for instance on civic identity, on Turkishness, on Turkish citizenship, a critical approach employs the experience of, for instance, Istanbul Greeks or Armenians or non-Muslims to understand not how Turkish citizenship was defined in, for instance, constitutional law or in the citizenship law, but how it was experienced and performed in everyday life. So these are basically my suggestions or cornerstones for a post-Kemalist revision of Turkish history. And basically I will discuss, before I get into some conclusions, I'd like to say a few words on my methodology and also give you a flavor of what this book is about and how it deals with things. So how did I write this book? Well, as I tried to show, there's not much literature really in terms of a critical reconsideration of Turkey's recent past. But there is a growing high-quality scholarship, especially in non-historical disciplines, which have broken with the taboos and myths of Republican historiography. Many of these revisionist approaches share a common angle, yet they nevertheless, and by definition, are particularistic accounts. You have, for instance, now an explosion in alternative histories of Kurds, of Armenians, of genocide, but also of Alevi identity. Even there's now kind of a project of rewriting Turkish history, of writing LGBT individuals into modern Turkey. But what is interesting here is that these literatures don't speak to each other. So they basically create parallel histories. And I think the question really is how you bring these different critical post-Kemalist histories perspectives into an inclusive framework. How do you forge this into a narrative on the people of Turkey rather than on Turks? And Angry Nation is trying to do this. Now, in this book, I worked with I don't know what Effie would say about this. She'd probably not like it, but I say that it's a very permissive understanding of ethnographic fieldwork. So it's basically based on expert interviews, participant observation, and archival studies. At its core are interviews with people who have played significant public roles in Turkey's recent history: activists, scholars, academics, politicians. Many of them have a liberal or socialist perspective. Some are Kurdish nationalists, others Turkish nationalists, or they come from movements rooted in political Islam. So it's not representative, but I've tried to kind of represent different voices and get a wide range of different voices. And to give you a taste really, but also to introduce some of